A rich man pushed my 8-year-old grandson to the ground and laughed in my face. He had no idea the old grandma he was mocking had once commanded hundreds of soldiers. Then I looked him dead in the eyes and said 3 words. That made him laugh even harder. "Call me Colonel. I need you to picture this exactly the way it happened, because I have gone over it in my mind so many times now that I could walk you through every second of it blindfolded. It is a Tuesday afternoon in Millbrook Hollow, the kind of ordinary afternoon where nothing is supposed to happen. And my grandson, Jonah, is running ahead of me on the sidewalk outside Miller's Creamery with his arms out like airplane wings, laughing at absolutely nothing, the way 8-year-old boys laugh when the whole world still feels safe to them. I am 71 years old. I spent 31 years in the United States Army, and I retired at the rank of Colonel. And I want you to hold on to that fact, because in about 30 seconds, a man in an expensive coat is going to forget it entirely, right up until the moment he cannot forget it anymore. A black SUV pulls up onto the curb, blocking half the sidewalk like the street belongs to it. A man steps out, phone against his ear, moving fast, talking loud about numbers and deals, and people who are going to regret wasting his time. And he is not looking down at all. Not even once, and where his feet are going is directly into my grandson. Jonah goes down hard, knee first, then his palms, and that terrible silent gasp children make right before the crying actually starts. The sound of the wind getting knocked clean out of a small body. I am at his side before my own mind has finished catching up, because 31 years of training does not leave a person. Just because the uniform came off, it lives in the muscles. It lives in the reflexes. It lives in the 2 seconds it takes an old woman to drop to her knees on a public sidewalk without a single thought for her own joints. The man does not stop walking. He does not glance down. He keeps talking into that phone like nothing at all just happened in front of him. "Sir," I say, and I say it in a voice that has stopped formations of 200 soldiers dead in their boots. He turns, slowly. The way a man turns when he has already decided, before he even looks at you, that whatever you have to say does not deserve his attention. He looks at Jonah on the ground. He looks at me, and then he laughs, not nervous, not embarrassed. A real laugh, short and sharp, like something about the whole scene genuinely amuses him. "Kid should watch where he's standing," he says, already lifting the phone back to his ear. I stand up. Every joint in my body objects loudly. "I do not care. You will apologize to this child," I say. He smiles at that, the way you might smile at a dog that has just done something cute and pointless. "And who's going to make me?" I do not raise my voice. A raised voice is often a weak voice. That is something the years teach you, if you let them. I step close enough that he actually has to look at me instead of past me, and 4 words come up out of somewhere old and steady inside my chest. Words I did not plan. "Call me Colonel," I say. Something flickers across his face for half a second. Maybe the beginning of doubt. It does not last. It curdles into something worse, and he laughs loud enough that people 2 doors down turn their heads. "Colonel," he repeats, tasting the word like a joke somebody told badly. "Colonel of what, ma'am? The Neighborhood Watch Committee?" He looks me up and down. My cardigan, my sensible shoes, the reading glasses hanging on their chain, and he shakes his head like the whole thing delights him. I don't answer to old women playing dress-up. I have an actual business to run. He gets back into that SUV. The door shuts with a heavy, expensive sound, and it pulls away from the curb like it was never there at all. Like my grandson's scraped knee behind it means absolutely nothing. I help Jonah up. His palms are raw, his knee already purpling, and he looks at me with the particular wide eyes that children get when they are still deciding how frightened, to be based on how frightened the adult beside them looks. "Grandma," he says, "why did that man laugh at you?" I brush the gravel from his palms, gentle, careful, my hands doing one thing while my mind is already doing another entirely. "Because he doesn't know me yet, baby," I tell him. But he's about to. I want to be honest with you about what I felt watching that SUV disappear around the corner by the old feed store. It was not sadness. It was not even really anger, not the hot kind. It was something colder and steadier, the kind of feeling that used to settle over me right before a difficult operation. Calm wearing Focus's clothing. Or maybe it is the other way around. I have never been entirely sure which one wears which. Millbrook Hollow is not a big place. Main Street runs 6 blocks end to end, past the hardware store, and the church and the diner, and the little brick town hall with its flag out front. And everybody who has lived here longer than a year or two knows. Everybody else's dog by name, even if they cannot always remember the owners. It is the kind of town where a scraped knee on a public sidewalk does not stay a private matter for very long, and where a man who moves in with enough money to buy up half of it will, sooner or later, run straight into the fact that money has never once been the thing that actually runs this place. What runs this place is the people who have stayed through every hard winter, every factory that closed, every young person who left for the city, and every young person who came back. And none of that shows up on a balance sheet, though it should, because I am not simply somebody's grandmother who enjoys her garden and her church potluck, though I enjoy both of those things very much. I went into the army at 19 years old, barely able to make my own bed properly, and I came out 31 years later, a full-bird colonel, one of the first women in this whole region to hold that rank in my particular branch. I commanded soldiers who trusted me with their lives, and every single one of them came home, and I carry that fact quietly, the way some people carry a rosary, close to the chest, always. My late husband was also a colonel, Richard Thorne. I am not going to spend this story dwelling on the years we had together, because Richard is not walking this earth to help me handle a man who pushes children down on public sidewalks, and I did not need him to. I needed my own 2 feet, my own steady hands, and 31 years of knowing exactly how to handle a man who believes his money makes him bulletproof. Jonah's mother, my daughter Renee, picks him up at 5 that same evening, and I tell her quietly on the porch while he watches cartoons inside, careful to keep my voice level so it does not carry through the screen door. I watch her face move through the exact stages mine had moved through an hour earlier. Shock first, then fury, then something more focused, something I recognize, because she grew up watching me handle things this exact way. "Mom," she says, "you have to report this. He could have really hurt him." I intend to do considerably more than report it, I tell her. She knows that particular tone. It is the tone I used the single time a teacher tried to hold her back a grade over a paperwork error nobody would fix. It is not a loud tone. It is a tone that means the question of whether something is going to happen has already been settled, and now we are only discussing how. Before she leaves with Jonah, I crouch down to his level one more time, careful of my knees, and I ask him how the scrape feels now that we have cleaned it up and put a bandage over it. "It's okay," he says, though his lower lip still trembles a little when he says it. "Grandma, are you going to be a colonel again?" The question catches me somewhere in the chest, because in his mind, apparently being a colonel is something you put down and pick back up depending on the situation. Like a coat. I tell him the truth the way I try always to tell him the truth, even when the shorter version would be easier. "I never stop being one, baby," I say. "Some days it just doesn't show as much as others." He nods slowly, the way children nod when they have decided to trust an answer, even if they do not fully understand it yet. And he hugs me around the neck before Renee carries him to the car, and I stand on my porch and watch their taillights disappear down Ponderosa Court, and something in me settles into a kind of stillness I recognize from a long time ago. The stillness that comes right before you commit fully to a course of action and stop wasting energy wondering whether you should. I go inside, hang my cardigan on the hook by the door, and put the kettle on. My house is quiet the way it always is these days, quiet in a manner that used to unsettle me after Richard passed and now mostly just feels like mine. I sit at the kitchen table where I have made every important decision of the last decade of my life, and I begin. That night I do not sleep, which at 71 is nothing unusual. Except this particular sleeplessness has a purpose behind it. I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going. Cold, and I do exactly what 31 years of service teaches a person to do before any operation. I gather information. It does not take long to learn who he is, because in a town the size of Millbrook, Hollow, a man who owns half of Main Street, does not stay a stranger for long. His name is Desmond Kane. He bought the old feed store 2 years back and turned it into loft apartments nobody in this town can actually afford. He owns the stretch of buildings that used to house the hardware store, the shoe repair shop, and Old Manny's diner, all 3 of which got pushed out when he tripled the rent inside 18 months. And according to my neighbor Dot Halloway, who reads the local paper cover to cover every single morning at her kitchen table, he is right now in the middle of pushing through a development that would tear down the community park, the very park where Jonah plays every single weekend, to build luxury condominiums with a view of nothing in particular. The council vote on that development is scheduled for 11 days from now. I sit with that information a long while, turning the cold cup in slow circles, and I feel that old familiar click in my mind, the one that used to arrive right before. I briefed a room full of officers on a plan I already knew was going to work because I had made absolutely certain it would. Desmond Kane believes he encountered a helpless old woman on a sidewalk. He has actually encountered a colonel with 11 days, a town full of people who love that park, and nothing left in the way of patience for men who laugh at children on the ground. The next morning I put on real shoes, not my gardening ones, and I walked down to the Millbrook Hollow Town Hall, a squat brick building with a flag out front. I always make a point to salute quietly out of old habit as I pass it. I ask Pauline at the front desk, who has known me 20 years, for a copy of the development proposal, and she hands it over without much fuss. I sit on the bench in the hallway and I read every page twice, the way I used to read mission briefs, looking not just for what is written, but for what has carefully been left out. What is left out tells me plenty. The proposal calls the park underutilized public space. I have stood in that park on a Saturday morning and watched 40 children running around it at once, 3 birthday parties happening under 3 separate picnic shelters, old men playing chess at the stone tables, by the fountain the town put in back, when I still had dark hair. Underutilized is a word chosen by somebody who has never once stood in that park and has no intention of starting. There is also a small paragraph near the back, easy to skim past if you're not looking for it, admitting the development will require a variance on the flood zoning, because the western edge of that park sits low, close to Miller's Creek, and there is a reason nobody has ever built anything permanent on that particular stretch of ground. My late husband used to say every plan has one paragraph. The author hopes nobody reads carefully. He was right about a great many things, and he was right about that. I make several copies of that page. I also call a young attorney named Felix Marchetti, whose late mother used to sing beside me in the church choir and who now practices land use law out of a small office 2 towns over. I have known Felix since he was in short pants, and he still calls me Mrs. Hartwell out of old habit, even though I have told him 100 times to just use my name. Mrs. Hartwell, he says when I explain what I am reading and fax him a copy. This is sloppier than it should be for a project this size. Whoever drafted this was betting nobody outside the developer's own team would read it closely. He goes quiet for a moment, and I can hear him flipping pages on his end of the line. You're right about the variance. And there's something else you might not have caught. The traffic study attached to this thing was conducted in February on a Tuesday morning, when half this town's school children are inside a classroom, and the park is basically empty. That's not an accident. That's a study designed to produce a specific answer. Can that be challenged? It can absolutely be challenged, Felix says. I'll write you a memo you can hand to the council. Plain language, no legal jargon, laying out exactly why that traffic study doesn't reflect actual weekend usage. Won't cost you a thing. Consider it my mother's choir robe, still owed. I laugh despite myself, the first real laugh I have had since the sidewalk, and I thank him and true to his word. 2 days later a clean careful memo arrives in my mailbox. 3 pages. Easy enough for anyone in that gymnasium to follow without a law degree. And I add it to the growing folder I am building on my kitchen table, right behind Ellis's photographs and Felix's flood zoning notes. Then I do the thing Desmond Kane never once considers I might do, because men like him spend so much time looking up the ladder at people with more money that they entirely forget to look sideways at the ordinary folks standing right beside them, the people who make up the actual bones of a town like this one. I call everyone I know. I call Ellis Faraday, who runs the hardware store his grandfather built and who lost his original location to Kane's rent hikes 2 years back and has never forgiven it. I call Priscilla Odom, who heads the local VFW post, a woman who served 2 tours as a combat medic and does not scare easily. I call Reverend Otis Grimm at First Millbrook Baptist, who baptized my daughter and buried my husband and has, not once in 20 years, failed to show up when this town needed him. I call Old Manny himself, 78 years old, who lost the diner his father opened in 1959 when Kane tripled his lease. I call 3 soldiers I once led, folks who still live within an hour's drive, people who would show up to a fight for me without asking a single question about why. By the end of the first day, I have 11 people committed to speaking at the town council meeting. By the 4th day, that number is closer to 40. Priscilla gets the entire VFW post involved. Ellis paints a sign for his hardware store window, plain and hand-lettered, Save Millbrook Park, and folks start stopping their cars just to ask him what it means. On the 4th day, a young woman named Ada Whitfield calls my house. She writes for the Millbrook Gazette, a paper that used to come out every day back when I was raising. Renee and now comes out twice a week if the printer is behaving. And she tells me Dot Holloway gave her my number. I hear you're organizing against the Kane development, she says. I'd like to write about it, if you're willing to talk to me. I invite her over for coffee that same afternoon. She sits at my kitchen table with a small recorder and a notebook, and I lay out everything for her, the way I would lay out a mission brief. Plainly in order, nothing embellished, because the truth does not need embellishing when it is this clear. I show her my copy of page 31. I tell her about Old Manny's lease, about Ellis's hardware store, about the sidewalk outside Miller's Creamery, though I ask her not to lead with that part because I do not want this to look like an old woman's personal grudge, dressed up as a public concern. It isn't personal to you at all? She asks. And there is a gentleness in the question, not a challenge. It became bigger than personal the moment I read that proposal. I tell her, what happened to my grandson is what got my attention. What is happening to this whole town is what kept it. She thanks me and tells me she wants to speak with a few other people before she writes anything, and I give her Ellis's number, and Priscilla's and Old Manny's, though I warn her Manny takes some patience on the phone these days. That same evening I walked 2 blocks over to see Corinne Blakely, who owns the flower shop that used to sit beside Old Manny's diner before. Kane's rent increase pushed her into a much smaller space above the laundromat, half the square footage for nearly the same price. Corinne is younger than most of the folks I have been calling, maybe 45, with soil permanently worked into the creases of her hands, and when I knock on her door she looks surprised to see me standing there. "Colonel Hartwell," she says, because word has already traveled about the sidewalk. "Come in, please." Her new shop is cramped, buckets of flowers stacked closer together than they should be, but she has made it work the way people who refuse to be beaten always seem to make things work. I ask her the same question I asked Manny, whether Kane ever gave her a real chance to negotiate, and her answer is nearly identical. A form letter, a number with no room to discuss it. Take it or lose the shop her mother started. I almost didn't tell anyone, she admits, wrapping a bundle of daisies out of habit while we talk. It felt like admitting I'd failed at something, but it wasn't a failure. It was just a man deciding my mother's shop mattered less than his margins. I ask if she would be willing to speak at the council meeting, and she hesitates only a moment before saying yes. By the time Ada Whitfield's article runs in the following Thursday's edition of the Gazette, under the headline Millbrook Holloway's Cost of Kane Development, She has spoken with 9 different business owners, 3 former employees of Kane's management company, who asked to remain unnamed, and a structural engineer from Bend who reviewed the flood zoning. Paragraph at my request and told Ada, on the record, that building on that stretch of ground without significant mitigation would be, in his words, financially reckless. The article does not mention my grandson at all, which is exactly how I wanted it. It is not a story about an old woman's wounded pride. It is a story about a town, and that is a story people cannot dismiss nearly as easily. I do not seek out Desmond Kane during those 11 days. I do not confront him again. Do not show up outside his glass office on the edge of town. Do not send him a single message. Some folks might call that restraint. I call it strategy, because there is a particular kind of power in letting a man believe he has already won, right up until the exact moment he learns otherwise. On the 5th day, I visit old Manny in his kitchen, behind the empty diner now sitting under a for-lease sign priced at a number nobody in this town could afford, and I ask him a simple question over coffee. Did Kane ever offer you a real chance to negotiate that lease? I ask. Or did he just raise the number and let the number do the talking? Manny's hands shake slightly around his cup. 78 years finally catching up with. A man who spent 50 of them on his feet before sunrise. He never met with me himself, he says. Sent a young fellow in a suit who wouldn't look me in the eye. Said the market had changed. Said if I couldn't make the new number work, that was a business problem, not his. I write that down, not because my memory has failed me. It has not. But because a wrong written on paper becomes a different kind of real than a wrong simply carried in your chest. On the 6th day, Priscilla and I sit at the VFW post, going through every single person we know who has been pushed out, priced out or pushed aside by Desmond Kane in the 2 years since he arrived in this town, like he already owned the deed to it. We find 9 businesses, 9 families whose livelihoods were quietly dismantled by a man who calls it market forces and calls it business decisions and never once calls it what it actually is, which is cruelty wearing a very nice suit. That same evening, one of the soldiers I once led, a man named Gary Osei, who now lives 40 minutes east in the town of Prineville and works for the county, calls me back about a favor I had asked of him 2 days earlier, which was simply to ask around whether anyone in his town had ever heard the name Desmond Kane. Colonel, he says, and old habits mean he will call me that until the day one of us is in the ground. You're not going to believe this. He tried the exact same thing out here 3 years ago. Different town, different park, same playbook. Underutilized land, glossy renderings. A variance nobody read carefully. Town fought it and won, and he packed up and moved on before anyone thought to write it down anywhere official. Do you have anyone who would speak to that? I ask him, if it came to it. I know a councilwoman out here who remembers it clear as day, he says. She'll talk to you. Might even come speak herself if you need her to. I write her name down in my notebook beside Manny's, beside Corinne's, beside Ellis's, a growing column of ordinary people who have watched the same man run the same con in more than one town, and simply never had the numbers, until now, to make him answer for it in any of them. On the 7th day, I do something I had not planned, but the idea feels right once it arrives. I go directly to his office. His building sits at the edge of town, all glass, catching the sky in a way that always struck me as a little arrogant, more interested in impressing the highway than fitting into the town around it. I walk in wearing my good coat, hair set, reading glasses tucked properly into my handbag, and I tell the young woman at the front desk I would like 5 minutes of Mr. Kane's time. She looks at me the way young people sometimes look at older women, a little kindly, a little dismissively, both at once, and tells me his schedule is completely full for weeks. That's all right, I say. I'll wait. I sit in that lobby, back straight, hands folded, the exact posture I once held through briefings that ran hours long, and I wait. 20 minutes, 40, an hour. People come and go, glancing at me the way you glance at a fixture in a room, an old woman sitting patiently, no threat at all. At the hour and 10-minute mark, Desmond Kane himself walks through on his way to some meeting, phone in hand as always, and he stops mid-stride when he sees me. "You," he says, and there is real disbelief in it, like he cannot comprehend the woman from the sidewalk followed him here. "Me," I agree, standing, because standing to greet someone is simply good manners, even when the someone in question has none himself. "Look," he says, impatience sharpening his voice. "If this is about the other day, I don't have time. Kids fall down. It happens. I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, but I have actual work to do. I'm not here about my feelings," I say. "I'm here about Miller's Creek." Something flickers across his face, quick, gone almost before it starts. The flicker of a man just reminded of the one paragraph he hoped nobody would find. "I don't know what you're talking about," he says, a half-second too fast. "The flood zoning variants," I say, keeping my voice level. Pleasant, even. The voice I used when I already held the winning hand and saw no reason to raise it. "Page 31 of your development proposal. I hope your engineers looked closely at that creek bank, Mr. Kane, because I have lived in this town longer than you have been alive, and I have watched that creek jump its banks 3 times in my life. The last time was 1994. It put 4 feet of water into the old grocery that used to stand right there." He says nothing for a moment. Around us, his employees have slowed their walking, not quite stopping, but clearly listening the way. People always listen when they sense a real conversation instead of the usual polite nothing. "That's a scare tactic," he finally says. "And it won't work. The council votes in 4 days, and my proposal has the support it needs." "Does it?" I say, not quite a question. "It does." "Well," I say, gathering my handbag, unhurried. "I suppose we'll both find out Thursday." I leave him standing in his own lobby, phone still in hand, and I do not look back to see his face, because I do not need to. I can feel it on the back of my neck the whole way to the door, and it is not the look of a confident man anymore. Word travels fast in a town this size, and within 2 days, everybody who signed up to speak has heard about the flood, zoning paragraph, and Ellis Faraday, who used to work summers surveying land before he took over the hardware store, drives out to the creek himself, with a level and a stack of old survey photographs he had kept in a box in his garage since the flood of '94. He brings those photographs to the VFW post, and we lay them out on the folding table, water up to the second porch step of the old grocery, and Priscilla says quietly, "Well, that settles what I'm bringing to the meeting. There is a night, somewhere around the 9th day, when the doubt finally catches up with me. It comes late after Jonah's bedtime call from Renee, after I have hung up the phone and sat, alone in the quiet of my kitchen with nothing left to do but wait for morning. I think about how much easier this would all be if I simply let it go, if I told myself an apology on a sidewalk was enough, if I let a man with more lawyers than I have years left just build his condominiums and move on to the next town the way men like him always eventually do. I think about how tired my knees have been since I knelt beside Jonah on that pavement, how the folder of documents on my table has grown thick enough now to need a rubber band around it, how Priscilla and Ellis and Manny and Corinne have all rearranged pieces of their own lives around a fight that started because of what happened to my grandson, and not to any of them. I call Priscilla, later than I probably should, and she picks up on the second ring the way people do when they have spent decades being ready for calls at odd hours. "You having a wobble, Colonel?" she asks, and there is no judgment in it at all, only the particular kindness of someone who has had the exact same wobble herself more than once. I keep thinking about whether I've pulled all of you into something that was really just mine to carry, I tell her. "Let me ask you something," Priscilla says. "When that flood took out the old grocery in '94, whose problem was that? The whole town's. And when Manny lost his diner, whose problem was that? His and ours, I suppose, once we let it be." "That's right," she says. "You didn't drag anybody into anything, Bernice. You just finally said out loud what half this town had been quietly swallowing for 2 years. That's not a burden you put on us. That's a door you opened, that we all decided to walk through. Ourselves." She pauses. "Get some sleep. You've got a meeting to win." I do not sleep much that night either, but the doubt loosens its grip enough that I can at least lie still and let my mind rest. And by morning it has passed the way most doubts do once you say them out loud to someone who has earned the right to hear them. The night before the vote, I cannot sleep, and I do not try particularly hard to. I sit at my kitchen table again, and Jonah's crayon drawing is still stuck to my refrigerator with an apple-shaped magnet. The two of us as stick figures under a crayon sun. And I look at it a long while. I think about the men and women I led decades ago into situations far more dangerous than a town council meeting. I think about how leadership was never really about being the loudest voice in a room. It is about knowing your people, knowing your terrain, knowing precisely where the other side is weak, and having the patience to wait for the moment that weakness matters most. Desmond Kane's weakness was never his money. His weakness is that he never once, in 2 years in this town, bothered to learn a single name that did not appear on a lease agreement or a ledger. He does not know Manny has a bad hip from 50 years on his feet. He does not know Ellis's grandfather built that hardware store with his own hands after coming home from a war. He does not know Priscilla pulled wounded soldiers out of places most folks only see in nightmares. And a woman like that does not frighten easily and does not forget an injustice quickly either. He does not know any of us. And a man who does not know the people around him will always, eventually, underestimate exactly how many of them are standing together against him. The town council meeting is held in the gymnasium of the old middle school because the regular chambers only seat 60 and word has gotten around this particular meeting is not going to be quiet. I arrive early. I wear my good coat and pin beneath the lapel, where most folks would not even notice unless they looked closely. I wear my service pin, small, simple, gold, not for show, just for me. Just so I remember standing there, exactly who I have always been, long before I was anybody's grandmother. By the time the meeting starts, the gymnasium is full. Standing room, folding chairs brought from the cafeteria, people lined along the back wall. Ellis's signs are everywhere, hand-painted, some clearly made by children. And Jonah sits beside me in the second row swinging sneakers that do not quite reach the floor, holding a sign he made himself at the kitchen table 2 nights before. "Desmond." Kane arrives with a small team of lawyers and a slideshow prepared on a laptop, looking entirely confident, entirely unbothered, a man who has clearly done this exact routine in a dozen other towns and watched it work every single time. He gives his presentation first, smooth, polished, full of phrases like community investment and modern growth and economic revitalization, phrases that sound wonderful, floating in the air and mean almost nothing once you actually examine them. Glass buildings and manicured walkways flash on the screen, and for a moment I watch a few faces in the room soften, the way faces do when someone shows you a beautiful picture and asks you to imagine it belongs to you. Then the council chairwoman, a steady woman named Louise Abernathy, who has run this town's meetings for 11 years, opens the floor to public comment. And that is when Millbrook Hollow shows Desmond Kane exactly who he has been laughing at all along. Old Manny stands first, leaning on his cane, and tells the room in a voice that cracks more than once about 50 years, of eggs and coffee and regulars who became family, about a lease he was never given a fair chance to negotiate. Ellis stands next and talks about his grandfather's hammer, still hanging in his new, smaller, far more expensive location, and about what it means when a town starts trading its history for a view of nothing. Priscilla stands in her VFW jacket and says, without raising her voice at all, that she spent 2 tours making sure this country's soil stayed free, and she would be damned before she let a flood zone get paved over so a handful of people who do not even live in this town could look at a river from a balcony. Reverend Grimm speaks about community. Dot Holloway speaks about 30 years of birthday parties. A 12-year-old girl named Marisol Vance stands, hands shaking, and says the park is the only place her family can afford to hold her birthday party, And she does not understand why a rich man needs it more than she does. Corinne Blakely stands next, still in her work apron because she came straight from the shop, and she tells the room about her mother's flower stand, about the letter that gave her 30 days to accept a number she could not possibly meet, about building a smaller life, above a laundromat because a man 3 states away decided her margins mattered, less than his. When she sits down, the woman beside her, a stranger to me, reaches over and squeezes her hand. Then a young schoolteacher named Naomi Cross, who teaches 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary, stands and tells the council that 1/3 of her students live within walking distance of that park, and that for a good number of them it is the only green space they have, because their families cannot afford summer camps or vacations or backyard swing sets. I watch what that park does for those kids every single day, she says, her voice thick. It is not underutilized. It is essential. I would ask whoever wrote that word to come sit on the swings with my students for one recess, before they use it again. Then it is my turn. I stand slowly, not because I need to, but because standing slowly draws every eye in a room. And I have learned that a room's attention is a resource, same as time, same as ground, and you do not waste it by rushing. My name is Bernice Hartwell, I say, and my voice carries to the back wall without needing to rise, because 31 years of giving orders on open ground teaches a person exactly how to fill a room. Some of you know my late husband, Colonel Richard Thorne. What some of you do not know, because I do not often mention it, is that before I was anybody's wife or anybody's grandmother, I was a colonel myself in the United States Army. For 31 years, the room goes very quiet. 11 days ago, I continue, Mr. Kane pushed my 8-year-old grandson to the pavement outside Miller's Creamery, did not stop to check on him, and when I asked him to apologize, he laughed in my face and told me I could not make him do anything. I let that settle over the room the way a held breath settles before it releases. I did not come here tonight for an apology. Mr. Kane, I came here because a man who cannot be bothered to notice a child on the ground in front of him is exactly the kind of man who writes underutilized public space in a proposal about a park where 40 children play on any given Saturday, and quietly slips a flood variance into page 31, hoping nobody in this room reads that far. I watch his face go pale under the gymnasium lights. I have spent 31 years learning how to read a battlefield, I say. I know how to spot the ground nobody wants to talk about. I would ask this council to consider what happens to this town's insurance rates, this town's liability, and quite possibly this town's homes, the next time Miller's Creek decides to remember where it used to run. I sit back down. Jonah looks up at me with an expression somewhere between confusion and pure, uncomplicated pride, and he whispers, loud enough for the row behind us to hear, Grandma, you're really a colonel. I really am, baby, I tell him. Kane's lawyer stands to offer a rebuttal, something about the traffic study being conducted according to standard industry practice. But Louise Abernathy, holding Felix's memo in her hand, asks him directly whether standard industry practice generally involves measuring park usage on a school morning in February rather than a weekend in summer, and the lawyer hesitates a beat too long before answering, and that hesitation says more to the room than any answer could have. Kane himself does not stand to speak again. He sits very still at the folding table set up for his team, his slideshow still glowing uselessly on the screen behind him. And for the first time since the sidewalk, I watch him look genuinely uncertain about what happens next. The council does not vote that night. Louise Abernathy, sensing correctly that the room needs more than one meeting to properly weigh what has just been laid out, tables the vote pending an independent engineering review of the flood zoning concerns. Those 2 weeks of waiting are their own kind of trial, quieter than the meeting itself but no less demanding. Ada Whitfield runs a follow-up piece in the Gazette, summarizing the engineering questions raised, and the story gets picked up by a television station out of Bend, a young reporter standing at the edge of the park with the creek visible behind her, asking viewers whether they remembered the flood of '94. Holloway clips both articles and pins them to the corkboard outside the post office. where half the town stops to read them on their way in for stamps. I keep myself busy during those 2 weeks the way. I have always kept myself busy when a decision is out of my hands and waiting is the only order left to give. I work in my garden. I have supper twice with Priscilla and her husband, going over what we would say if a second meeting becomes necessary. I take Jonah to the park himself most afternoons, and I watch him climb the same rusted jungle gym that has stood there since before Renee was born, and I think about how close that structure came to being cleared away for a rendering of glass and steel that nobody in this town actually asked for. On the 9th day of waiting, a young engineer named Priya Suresh, the one hired to conduct the independent review, walks the creek bank herself with a clipboard and a measuring wheel, and Ellis walks beside her the whole afternoon, pointing out the old high water, mark still faintly visible, on the stone foundation of what used to be the grocery. I am told she takes careful notes and does not say much, which Ellis takes as a good sign, because engineers who already know the answer rarely need to take that many notes. The review comes back on the 14th day. It confirms exactly what Ellis's old photographs already showed, that the western edge of that park cannot be safely developed without millions of dollars in flood mitigation the project could never justify. Kane's development dies there quietly. In an engineering report nobody outside the town office gets particularly excited about, which is exactly the kind of ending that suits a man like Desmond Kane the least, because there is no dramatic confrontation for him to rise above, no headline to spin, just a slow, complete, bureaucratic collapse of everything he had been counting on. I learn much later from Ada Whitfield, who by then has become something like a friend, that the day after the engineering review came back, Kane held a conference call with his investors that lasted less than 11 minutes. One of them, a man from a firm in Seattle, apparently told him flatly that a flood liability nobody had disclosed during due diligence was the kind of oversight that ended partnerships, not just projects, and that they would be reviewing every other deal currently on Kane's desk. Ada heard this secondhand from someone who worked in his office at the time, someone who left the company not long after and was willing, off the record, to describe the mood in that building as something close to a funeral. I do not take pleasure in imagining that room. I take a quieter kind of satisfaction in knowing that a man who built an entire career on being the one who springs surprises on other people finally understood exactly how it felt to be on the receiving end of one. I would love to tell you that is where this story ends, with Desmond Kane driving out of Millbrook Hollow for good. And honestly, for about 3 weeks, I believe that was exactly what would happen. His office goes quiet. The survey crews that had been marking the park disappear. Old Manny even jokes that maybe we have finally seen the last of him. We have not. 3 weeks after the vote, I open my front door to find Desmond Kane standing on my porch, alone, no lawyers, no phone pressed to his ear, wearing a coat that looks considerably less expensive than the one from the sidewalk. Or maybe it is the same coat, and he simply looks different wearing it now. My first instinct, I will not pretend otherwise, is suspicion. 31 years teaches you that a defeated man does not simply show up at your door to chat. But something in his posture is different. His shoulders are not squared the way they were in his own lobby. His eyes do not carry that particular gleam men get when they are calculating their next move. "Mrs. Hartwell," he says, and it is the first time he has used my actual name instead of ma'am or sweetheart or you. "Colonel Hartwell," he corrects himself, and I notice the correction costs him something to make. "Do you have a few minutes?" I could have shut the door. Some part of me, the part that still remembers the sound of my grandson hitting the pavement, wants to. But another part of me, the part that led soldiers for 31 years, knows a man standing on your porch admitting he was wrong is a different creature entirely than a man laughing in your face on a sidewalk. And the two situations call for entirely different responses. "You may come in," I say for tea. "Not for long." He sits at my kitchen table, the same table where I planned his defeat, and for a long moment he simply looks at his hands. "The project's dead," he says finally. The board pulled the funding after the flood report. My investors are furious. 2 other developments in nearby counties have already reconsidered working with me at all, because apparently word travels. He lets out a short breath that is not quite a laugh. You did that. All of you did that. You did that. I correct him gently, setting a cup of tea in front of him. We simply made sure people were paying attention. He is quiet a while. Then he says something I do not expect. My father built his first shopping plaza when I was 9 years old. I used to go to the site with him on weekends. He used to say the town was lucky to have him, that he was bringing them something better than what they had. He wraps both hands around the teacup like it is the only warm thing in the room. I think I've been saying that same thing my whole life without ever once asking whether it was true. It generally isn't, I say. Not the way you were saying it. No. He agrees quietly. I don't think it was. I do not comfort him. Forgiveness is not the same thing as comfort, and I have never believed in handing comfort to a man who has not yet earned it. But I sit with him, and I let him talk, and somewhere in the middle of it he tells me, without me asking, that he went to see old Manny 2 days earlier, and offered him his old lease back at the original rate, permanently in writing, along with a formal apology that Manny later tells me actually sounded sincere. He offered you the same, I say, or something similar. I imagine to Corinne Blakely. He looks up, surprised I know the name. Yesterday. He says quietly, she didn't believe me at first. Made me say it twice. Most people would, I say. You didn't give her much reason to expect otherwise. No, he agrees. I didn't. He turns the teacup slowly in his hands, not drinking from it, just holding it the way people hold things, when they need something to do with their fingers while their mind works through something harder. I spoke to a woman in Prineville, too, he says. Councilwoman there. I understand you had something to do with her calling me. I had a soldier of mine make an introduction, I say, and I do not apologize for it because I am not sorry. She told me what the town thought of me after I left. I didn't know they'd kept records. I didn't think anyone remembered. He shakes his head. I've done this before, Colonel Hartwell. Not exactly this, but something close to it more than once. I always told myself it was just business, that towns adapt or they don't, that I wasn't the one forcing anybody's hand. And now I think I've been telling myself a story that was easier to live with than the truth, he says. I think I've been doing that for a long time. Why? I ask him plainly. What changed? He looks at me a long moment, and something in his face reminds me, oddly, of young soldiers I once knew, the ones who arrived certain of their own invincibility and left, if they were lucky enough to survive their own foolishness, considerably more humble than when they started. You called yourself Colonel, he says, and I laughed because I thought it was a costume, a word an old woman used to sound important. It took me 3 weeks to understand it wasn't a costume at all. It was just the truth, and I was too busy looking down at you to notice. He shakes his head slowly. Nobody's ever made me feel that small, without raising their voice once. I don't need to raise my voice, I tell him, when I'm right. He almost smiles at that, the first real, unguarded expression I have seen on his face since the sidewalk. No, he says, I don't suppose you do. Now here is the part that I imagine surprises some of you, given everything I have just told you about the 11 days. I spent building a case against this man brick by brick, because I could have let him sit in that failure. I could have let the town's judgment of him stand as the final word. There is a version of this story where I simply nod at his apology, finish my tea, and send him back out my front door with nothing more than what he came in with. But I did not raise 31 years of soldiers by teaching them that victory means grinding a defeated man into the dirt forever. I raised them by teaching them that real strength includes the strength to offer a path forward once the lesson has actually landed. You will personally go see my grandson, I tell him, and apologize to him directly, man to boy, looking him in the eye. No lawyer standing behind you. I will, he says immediately. and you will use whatever is left of that considerable fortune of yours. I continue. To fund the renovation this town's park has needed for 15 years. New play equipment, proper drainage, since apparently that creek bed concerns you now as much as it concerns me. A shelter big enough for Marisol. Vance to have her birthday party in the rain if it comes to that. He nods slowly. And in exchange, I say, you get to stop being the man my grandson remembers as the one who pushed him down and laughed. You get to become something else instead. That's not something I can give you. Mr. Kane, that part you'll have to earn yourself. One decision at a time starting now. He comes to see Jonah that following Saturday, right there in the park, in front of the very bench where I first planned his downfall over a cup of cooling tea. He kneels down to my grandson's actual eye level, which I notice because 31 years teaches you to notice small physical choices that reveal a person's real intentions. And he tells my grandson he is sorry, genuinely and plainly, no excuses tucked into the apology the way grown men so often tuck excuses into their apologies without even realizing they are doing it. Jonah, being 8 years old and possessing a heart considerably more generous than most adults manage to hold on to, says it's okay, just don't push people anymore. I won't, Kane tells him, and something in his voice makes me believe it. The park renovation breaks ground 2 months later. Kane funds every cent of it, and more than that, he shows up himself, in work boots instead of his usual polished shoes, and helps Ellis Faraday's crew lay the new drainage pipes along Miller's Creek with his own 2 hands, blistered and sunburned by the second week, looking more like an actual person than he has looked in the 2 years since he first arrived in this town. Old Manny's diner reopens under its original lease, and Kane eats breakfast there most mornings now, alone at the counter, no entourage, no phone pressed to his ear, and I am told he tips generously, and always says please and thank you. Small things, but small things add up into the shape of a man over time. Corinne Blakely moves her flower shop back into its original space beside where Manny's diner now sits, and Kane covers the cost of the move himself without being asked twice. And Ellis Faraday, who spent 2 years watching his own hardware store shrink into a smaller and smaller footprint, gets an offer he almost refuses out of pure stubbornness, a renewed lease at his original location at the original rate. Please reimbursement for the cost of the move he never should have had to make in the first place. Ellis tells me later that he stood in Kane's office for a full minute before he could bring himself to shake the man's hand, and that when he finally did, Kane apologized a second time without being prompted, which Ellis says is the part that actually convinced him it was real. Naomi Cross gets her 3rd graders a standing invitation to plant a section of the new park garden every spring, funded permanently through a small trust Kane sets up with the town. And Marisol Vance gets her birthday party that very summer, under the new shelter, in the rain, exactly the way she had worried she might never get to have it. And I am told Kane sent a card, no gift, just a card, which struck me as exactly the right amount of involvement for a man, still learning where the line sits, between generosity and intrusion. None of this happens quickly, and none of it happens without setbacks. There is a week in the middle of the renovation where the new drainage contractor, Kane hires cuts corners on the pipe grading, and Priscilla catches it during a walkthrough and marches straight to Kane's office to say so. And to his credit, he fires the contractor within the hour and pays out of pocket for the correction, rather than letting the town absorb the delay. There is an afternoon where a reporter from a paper 2 counties over shows up, hoping to write something snide about a disgraced developer buying his way back into a town's good graces, and Kane, rather than hiding from it, sits down with her for over an hour and answers every hard question she asks without flinching, and the peace that runs afterward is more measured than either of us expected, which I suspect is exactly what honesty tends to earn you if you are willing to actually practice it. I will tell you honestly, I do not know if Desmond Kane has become a good man. I have led enough soldiers and lived enough years to know character is not a single decision. It is 1,000 small decisions stacked up one after another over months and years. And 3 months of good behavior does not erase 2 years of careless cruelty. Not entirely, not yet. But I do know this. He stops now. He looks people in the eye now. Last week, I watched him hold the door of Miller's Creamery for an elderly man with a walker and wait. Actually wait. Without checking his phone once, until the man made it all the way through. That is not nothing. In my experience, that is actually quite a lot. The town holds a proper grand reopening the following spring, on a Saturday morning bright enough that Dot Holloway declares it the finest weather Millbrook Hollow has seen in a decade, though Dot says that about at least 3 Saturdays a year and nobody holds it against her. Reverend Grimm gives a short blessing over the new shelter. Priscilla's VFW post sets up a table with lemonade and a folding banner that says something about honoring those who serve, which Priscilla insisted on including even though I told her it was not necessary. Naomi Cross brings her entire 3rd grade class, and they plant marigolds along the new garden border in uneven, cheerful rows that will no doubt need some quiet correcting from an adult once the children lose interest. But nobody minds that yet, because watching a line of 8-year-olds plant flowers with dirt up to their elbows is exactly the kind of thing that park was always meant to hold. Old Manny sets up a small folding table of his own, beside the new shelter and hands out coffee and half moon pies to anyone who wants one, refusing payment from every single person who tries to give it. And Corinne Blakely brings buckets of fresh-cut flowers to hand out to children, who mostly use them to chase each other around the fountain rather than carry them home intact, which Corinne says is exactly what flowers are supposed to be used for at that age. Kane comes, as I knew he would, standing near the back of the crowd in plain clothes, not making a speech, not asking to be thanked, just watching the town use the space he very nearly took from it. At one point, Marisol Vance runs up to him, breathless from playing tag, and asks him whether he is the man who fixed the park, and he crouches down to her level, the same way he once knelt to Jonah's, and tells her that a great many people fixed the park, and that he simply helped pay for the paint. It is, I think, the most honest sentence I have ever heard him say. As for the park, it is more beautiful now than it has ever been, with a shaded shelter big enough for every birthday party this town could ever need, drainage that will keep the creek exactly where it belongs, and a small stone bench near the entrance with a plaque the town council voted unanimously to install without telling me first. It simply reads in plain letters, for Colonel Bernice Hartwell, who reminded this town what it was worth defending. Jonah likes to run his fingers over the letters every time we walk past it. He still calls me Colonel sometimes, just to make me smile, and it works every single time. A few weeks after the plaque goes up, a woman named Corporal Denise Falk, who served under my command more than 20 years ago, and now lives clear across the state, drives 4 hours after seeing Ada's article shared online by someone in our old unit's group chat. She shows up at my door, with a bag of oranges from her own tree and no advance warning at all, which is exactly the kind of thing soldiers who serve together do, arrive unannounced and expect to be fed. "Colonel," she says, standing on my porch with that same steady posture I remember from 20 years ago. "I read what you did. Wanted to see your face when I told you I wasn't surprised at all." We sit on my back steps for 2 hours that afternoon, drinking coffee, and she tells me about her own life since we last served together. A husband, 3 grandchildren, a knee replacement that still aches in the rain. I tell her about Jonah, about Richard, about the sidewalk and the flood report and the plaque with my name on it that I still have not fully gotten used to seeing. Before she leaves, she squeezes my hand the way soldiers do instead of hugging, quick and firm, and tells me that command never really leaves a person. It just changes uniforms. No, I agree, it certainly does not. I think about that sidewalk a lot these days. Far more than I expected to. More than I probably let on even to. Renee, I think about the sound of my grandson hitting the pavement, and the sound of a man's laughter, carrying down the block like it cost him nothing at all. I think about how easy it would have been, at 71 years old, to simply let it go, To tell myself an old woman does not pick fights with men who own half of Main Street. To swallow the insult, the way so many people swallow insults every single day, because standing up feels harder than staying quiet. But I did not spend 31 years learning how to hold ground just to give it up on a sidewalk outside an ice cream shop. I did not bury a husband who wore his own uniform with pride just to let some man in an expensive coat teach my grandson that laughter is what power sounds like when it is unkind. Jonah was watching me that day, the same way he has watched me every day since. And children learn far more from what we do than from anything we ever tell them. He learned that his grandmother does not back down. He learned that a title is not a costume. It is a record of what a person has actually done and actually carried. And it does not stop meaning something just because somebody laughs at it. He learned that a town full of ordinary people, a hardware store owner, a diner cook, a combat medic, a pastor, a 12-year-old girl who just wanted a birthday party, can stand together and outlast a man who thought his money made him untouchable. And he learned, maybe most importantly, that when somebody finally does the hard work of becoming better, you let them. Because holding a grudge forever does not heal a scraped knee any faster. It only keeps the wound open longer than it needs to stay open. Some evenings now, Jonah and I walk down to that park just before the sun starts going down, and we sit on the bench with my name on it. And he tells me about his day at school. And sometimes Kane is there too, helping some other family carry a picnic table, or teaching a group of kids how to skip stones across the creek that almost cost him his entire fortune. And Jonah waves at him, and he waves back. And it is such a small, ordinary thing, and yet I never once take it for granted. People ask me sometimes if I regret how far I took it, whether an apology on that first sidewalk would have been enough, whether I needed the town hall, the flood report, the whole slow unraveling of a man's plans. And I tell them the truth. I did not do any of it for revenge. I did it because somewhere in this world there are a great many Desmond Canes. Men who have never once been told no by anybody who could actually make it stick. And every single time one of them gets told no and actually has to sit with it, actually has to change because of it, the world tips just slightly further toward decent. That is worth 11 days of my time. That is worth every ache in my knees from kneeling on that pavement. That is worth all of it, every single time. I think, too, about the version of myself that could have existed if I had never worn that uniform, never learned to read a room full of officers, never learned that patience and quiet, observation can accomplish, more than a raised voice ever will. I do not know that woman. I am grateful I never had to become her, because I do not think she would have known what to do on that sidewalk, except go home and cry about it. And there is no shame in that either. There are days it still nearly happens anyway. But 31 years gave me something I did not fully understand the value of until the exact moment I needed it most, which was the simple, unglamorous habit of not panicking, of gathering the facts, of trusting that the truth, laid out carefully enough in front of enough people who care, tends to win far more often than it loses. I hope that if you take nothing else from this story, you take that. You do not need a title to hold that kind of ground. You only need to refuse to be laughed out of it. Jonah is 9 now, taller every time I turn around, still losing his baby teeth one by one. He still runs ahead of me on the sidewalk outside Miller's Creamery, arms out like airplane wings. And every so often, without slowing down at all, he looks back over his shoulder just to make sure I am still there, still watching, still steady behind him. I am, always, and I intend to stay that way for as long as I am given, because a boy that age should never, not even for a moment, have to wonder whether the adults in his life will stand up when it truly matters. He already knows the answer, deep down, in the way children simply know things. He watched me prove it, and he will not forget it. So that is my story. A rich man pushed my grandson to the pavement outside an ice cream shop and laughed when I told him to call me Colonel. He learned, the way most people eventually learn if they are lucky, enough and humble enough to actually learn it, that the ground you choose to stand on matters a great deal less than the person standing on it, and that an old woman in sensible shoes can dismantle an empire quietly, patiently, without ever once needing to raise her voice, because some of us spent 31 years learning exactly how loud silence can be when it is backed up by the truth. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me where you are watching this from. Comment your city down below. I read every single one of them with my coffee in the morning, and I answer more of them than you might expect for a woman my age who still has to ask her grandson how the reply button works. And if you love your grandma, if she has ever stood up for you the way I stood up for my Jonah, hit that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today, because somewhere out there is another family who needs the reminder that standing your ground quietly, patiently, and with the truth on your side will always outlast a laugh meant to make you feel small. This is Colonel Bernice Hartwell, signing off, and I will see you in the next one.